sounds that JPEGMAFIA and Danny Brown use on their solo projects are very unique. People would consider it weird, even coming from Danny Brown when he described themselves here.
Weird black niggas. They be like, oh, there's another weird black nigga on the scene. Danny, you should be listening to this.
With both of their eccentric sounds, they came together and brought the people one of the most unique projects I've personally heard in a while. Scaring the Hoes Volume 1. The album sounds very rough at times with its hyper pop, overpowering bass, and scratchy vocals. And although that sounds like it would objectively be bad music, it's actually really good. Like, really good. I've never heard something quite as similar as this. Although that unperfect, rough sound has been gaining in popularity as of late, and people all around agree that it does sound good. While browsing Reddit, I actually did come across a really underground subgenre called Dariacore, which was popularized by the artist. We'll get more into that later. Lately, I have been seeing a trend with artists pushing the limits of their music and going more experimental. And I do think it is kind of necessary to do this in order to stick out from an oversaturated music industry, especially with the ease of streaming and recording being so readily available. Listening to this project with JPEG and Danny Brown, I'm not saying, oh, they're really doing something different to stick out from the crowd. It's way more natural in that than the other artists who are doing it. And I think it's because both of these artists built their platforms on being so different, essentially sticking out from that natural grain of all artists. Like, the story alone of JPEGMAFIA's come up is so crazy and unorthodox. At 18, Peggy enlisted in the US Air Force and mostly served in Iraq, but also in Kuwait, Germany, Japan, and North Africa. He served for 4 years before he was honorably discharged, which he described the process to an interviewer saying, you know how there's Harvey Weinstein and people like that get called out now? Just imagine that in the military, but they're your boss and you can't do anything about it. But imagine saying something about it, and now imagine everyone else being like, why are you saying something about it? Why aren't you going to the bro code? Now imagine having to try to get kicked out because of that. That's basically it. While in the desert of Iraq, Peggy was making beats religiously, living in really shitty conditions, contained in a super small hut and having active bombs going off around him constantly. Once he was discharged, he was able to form a small buzz in Japan with a group that he formed called Ghost Pop, but then he eventually settled in Baltimore to start his solo career, which is when his career really took off. JPEG has always described himself as a producer first and a rapper second. He actually became a rapper because no one wanted to rap on his weird beats when he was originally sending them out to people. It wasn't until 2018 when Veteran came out and he got a huge buzz that he told himself, I could do this as a career. And he did. Danny Brown came into the picture when he was shown one of JPEG's songs from his 2018 Veteran called Baby I'm Bleeding, and Danny loved it. Then months later, one of Danny Brown's friends showed him a video of JPEG singing his song I Will from XXX word for word, and Danny was hyped on this.
Like, oh, this nigga fuck with me. Oh,
yeah,
shit.
that makes,
This nigga my friend.
Yeah.
Before the culmination of Scaring the Hoes Volume 1, Danny Brown and JPEGMAFIA made their first appearance at the Smokers Club Festival in April 2022. At the festival, they performed Perfect, with Danny Brown ending his set saying, "Motherfuckers get ready for Peggy and Danny, bitch, I'm out!" And then 9 months later, we'd finally get some news on this JPEG Danny Brown collab album that was on the way. And this news came from an IG post from JPEGMAFIA, which simply read Brown Peg Mafia 2023 with a carousel of pictures of both in the studio seemingly working on their collaborative project. A month later, Peggy would confirm this with a tweet that read, "The Danny collab is finished." And then finally, we get a taste of the music the next month in March when Peggy came onto the Danny Brown show and Danny spilled all the beans of the project before having JPEG play a snippet of Lean Beef Patty.
Lean Beef Patty, let's go.
Then leaks came through telling us exactly when the singles would drop, as well as the whole project and even the cover art and track list too. JPEGMAFIA's production is very distinct, and you can vividly hear it on Scaring the Hoes because he produced every track. Prior to the project's release, I was perusing through JPEGMAFIA's subreddit and I came across an interesting thread. One user compared JPEG's sound to another sound that's actually a SoundCloud subgenre called Dariacore. SoundCloud called Dariacore. Jane Remover, who popularized Dariacore through the release of 3 projects, all titled Dariacore, goes by the moniker Leroy under these projects. I can actually see the similarities between Dariacore and the sounds on Scaring the Hoes Volume 1, but take a listen for yourself. Here's a snippet from Dariacore. The name Dariacore actually comes from Daria, an animated show on MTV during the late 90s and early 2000s. I watched some Daria growing up, and I gotta say, I love the naming of this genre. And the reason is because the show Daria comes from the early 2000s, and this sound is very much that wave of quintessential Y2K, early 2000s Web 1.0 aesthetic that so many youth now romanticize. I'd place Dariacore as a subgenre under hyperpop, which hyperpop again is that same aesthetic, with artists like 100 gecs, Glaive, Charlie XCX, and Grimes having made a solid career off of this sound as it's experienced a recent resurgence in popularity. This sound though is something that JPEGMAFIA has been creating for a while. As I mentioned prior, JPEG had a group in Japan called Ghost Pop, which had a very similar sound to hyperpop, although a bit less amped up as hyperpop is, but still had that nostalgic early 2000s sound very prominent in his group's music. Take this cover back in 2013 he did of Carly Rae Jepsen, whose side note is basically worshipped as the queen of this sound, having been a huge pioneer of its resurgence and inspiring so many artists to carry the sound forward. But yeah, JPEG covered her hit Call Me Maybe back in 2013. Take a listen.
This is crazy, but here's my number, so call me.
Hyperpop and Dariacore are a couple sounds that Danny Brown and JPEGMAFIA utilize on this project, but there's one more they use that I think fits in very nicely. That sound is rough, low fidelity, or lo-fi. This sound is heard on projects like Igor, The Money Store, Yeezus, and The Sound of Bad Habit. Its crunchy, overpowered bass and synths mixed with muddy vocals give off this low quality produced sound. And although technically low quality, it's far from that in the general sense. Artists have said it's really hard to perfect a sound like that. Kendrick said it best when interviewing Baby Keem for ID magazine. In talking about Keem's first project, The Sound of Bad Habit, he said he recorded the whole thing on a shitty USB mic in his room. Kendrick in response said that's what made it underground though. I'm gonna tell you now, it's gonna be hard to get that feeling back. You get as close as you want to it, but to actually have that feeling of being in your own room, in your hub, you can't. A track I think demonstrates this sound very clearly is the first song I heard by XXXTentacion titled Look At Me. Look At Me sounds so raw, with its overpowered bass, scratchy drums, and badly mixed vocals. Listen to this part specifically. So with all of these components, JPEG and Danny Brown fused them together to create their own unique sound. This sound delves from hyperpop, Dariacore, and lo-fi to create something totally new. And for this new sound, I would like to deem it Peggy Pop. As the appeal of hyperpop rises between artists and listeners alike, I think Peggy Pop will follow suit. In my eyes, it's just a more experimental version of hyperpop. And given the current landscape of music with everyone being so hungry to stick out from the norm, I think Peggy Pop has the potential to create a whole new wave within music. But I want to hear from you. What do you think of this new project? And do you think Peggy Pop could be a whole new wave in music? Let me know and check out our other videos.
If I knew you, I would send you to the stove. Pulled up in the Porsche, playing Kenny Lattimore. It's the matador, metaphors, you're wrong like the letter for trying to sell that stepped on Macklemore.